There are residential streets in older suburban neighborhoods where the physical proximity of houses creates illusion of community that doesn't actually exist in the social relationships between residents, where people live 10 feet apart separated only by property lines and hedges but remain functionally strangers who share space without sharing lives. Where the daily patterns of departure for work and return in evening and weekend yard maintenance occur in parallel without intersection, where politeness substitutes for connection and where the accumulated small distances between households create collective isolation that no individual resident consciously chose but that everyone perpetuates through habit and through assumption that their neighbors prefer privacy over engagement. Maplewood Lane had embodied this particular form of suburban disconnection for approximately 15 years, since the neighborhood's construction in the early 2000s had been home to approximately 35 households occupying single-family houses arrayed along both sides of the tree-lined street that ran for roughly half a mile between its intersections with larger arterial roads on either end. The houses on Maplewood Lane were modest but well-maintained, mostly three-bedroom colonial and ranch-style constructions built by same developer using variations on 4 or 5 basic floor plans, differentiated by exterior paint colors and landscaping choices and the various modifications and additions that homeowners had made over the years to customize properties that had started as nearly identical structures. The lots were small by contemporary suburban standards, maybe quarter-acre each, just enough space for small front yard with lawn and some foundation plantings, driveway leading to attached garage, modest backyard with maybe room for deck or patio and small play equipment if residents had children. The proximity meant residents were constantly within view and earshot of their neighbors, could hear lawn mowers and children playing and evening conversations on decks, could see comings and goings through their front windows, could observe the daily rhythms of neighboring households whether they particularly wanted to or not. But that enforced awareness hadn't translated into actual relationships for most residents, had instead created familiarity without intimacy, had made neighbors into known quantities whose names were remembered and whose faces were recognized but whose lives remained largely mysterious beyond what could be observed from external behavior. The typical weekday morning on Maplewood Lane, say a Thursday in late September, pleasant autumn weather with temperatures in the low 60s and clear skies, would involve approximately 25 to 30 adult residents departing for work between 6:30 a.m. and 8:30 a.m., backing their cars out of garages and driveways and heading toward the street's exits where they'd merge into morning traffic flowing toward the city center or toward the commercial areas where most residents worked. The departures would occur in waves roughly synchronized by work start times, people who needed to be at their jobs by 7 a.m. leaving first, people with 9 a.m. start times leaving later, the overall pattern creating brief periods of concentrated activity separated by quieter intervals. During these morning departures, residents would occasionally acknowledge each other, wave from car windows, offer brief, good morning, if they happened to be retrieving newspapers or checking mailboxes at the same time, exchange quick comments about weather or weekend plans if they encountered each other while walking to their vehicles. But these interactions were minimal, were performed more as social obligation than as genuine desire for connection, rarely extended beyond the most superficial pleasantries before residents would cite their need to get to work and would separate to continue their morning routines. The same pattern characterized weekend interactions. People would be outside more, mowing lawns, washing cars, working on landscaping projects, supervising children playing in yards, and would therefore have more opportunities for interaction. But most residents would work on their own properties without crossing property lines, would maintain the invisible boundaries that separated their spaces from their neighbors' spaces, would engage in the parallel solitary activities that constituted suburban weekend life without the activities becoming collective or collaborative. There were occasional exceptions, the annual neighborhood block party that the Homeowners Association organized, requiring residents to contribute covered dishes and to gather for awkward afternoon of forced sociability that most people attended more from obligation than enthusiasm. The informal networks that formed around shared circumstances, parents of young children who would coordinate playdates, older residents who would occasionally help each other with heavy lifting or other tasks that required assistance. But these exceptions were just that, exceptions to the general pattern of polite distance that characterized most relationships on Maplewood Lane. The residents weren't consciously choosing isolation. Most would have said they valued community, would have expressed appreciation for the idea of knowing their neighbors, would have described Maplewood Lane as a friendly neighborhood, despite the fact that friendly really just meant civil, rather than indicating actual friendship. But the combination of busy work schedules and family obligations and internalized norms about respecting others' privacy and simple habit had created an environment where connection required overcoming multiple barriers that made it easier to just maintain the established pattern of minimal engagement. Into this environment of polite disconnection, on a Saturday morning in late September, moved Mr. Leonard Whitmore and his dog Baxter. Mr. Leonard was 73 years old, widower for approximately 18 months since his wife Margaret's death from complications of pneumonia, relocating to Maplewood Lane from the house in different suburb where he and Margaret had lived for 42 years and had raised their 3 children who were now adults living in other cities with their own families. The relocation had been practical necessity. The previous house had been too large for one person, had required maintenance that was becoming difficult for Mr. Leonard to manage alone, had been filled with memories that were both comforting and painful in ways that had made continuing to live there feel increasingly untenable. The house on Maplewood Lane was smaller, 2 bedrooms, single-story ranch construction, modest yard that would be easier to maintain than the larger property he was leaving. The house had been purchased primarily for its practical attributes rather than for any particular attraction to the neighborhood or the community, had been one of several properties Mr. Leonard's realtor had shown him that met his basic requirements for size and price and accessibility. He'd known nothing about Maplewood Lane before purchasing the house, had made no effort to research the neighborhood's social dynamics or to determine whether it would be a welcoming environment for elderly widower who was not particularly social by nature. Baxter was mixed-breed dog of uncertain ancestry, appeared to be combination of golden retriever and possibly border collie or Australian shepherd, had shaggy medium-length fur that was primarily golden brown with white patches on chest and paws, stood maybe 20 inches at shoulder and weighed approximately 50 pounds, was 7 years old and had been part of Mr. Leonard and Margaret's household for the past 6 years. Margaret had been Baxter's primary caretaker, had been responsible for daily walks and feeding and the ongoing training and attention that dogs require, had developed particular bond with Baxter that had made the dog's presence one of the few consistent sources of joy during her final illness. After Margaret's death, Mr. Leonard had considered rehoming Baxter, had felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of sole dog ownership, had questioned whether he had the energy and capacity to provide adequate care, had worried that maintaining the dog was keeping him attached to the previous life he was trying to move beyond. But his children had encouraged him to keep Baxter, had argued that the dog provided companionship and routine that would be valuable during the difficult transition of living alone, had offered to help with dog care if Mr. Leonard's capacity became inadequate. So Baxter had accompanied Mr. Leonard to the new house on Maplewood Lane, had been present during the moving process, had explored the new environment with the mixture of curiosity and anxiety that dogs typically display when relocated to unfamiliar territory. The adjustment to the new house had been easier for Baxter than for Mr. Leonard. Dogs adapt to new spaces relatively quickly as long as their primary human companion is present, while humans carry accumulated associations and memories that make new spaces feel alien and disorienting even when those spaces are objectively comfortable and functional. The neighbors on Maplewood Lane had observed the moving process with the mild interest that new arrivals typically generated, had noted the moving truck in the driveway, had seen the furniture being carried into the house, had observed that the new resident appeared to be an elderly man living alone with a dog. A few neighbors had considered introducing themselves and offering welcome, but the general pattern of maintaining distance had prevailed, had made actively approaching a stranger feel like it would be intrusive or presumptuous, had resulted in most residents just observing from their own properties without making direct contact. Sarah Chen, who lived in the house directly across the street from Mr. Leonard's new residence, had been one of the few neighbors who'd made effort to introduce herself. She was 32 years old, mother of twin 4-year-old daughters named Emma and Sophie, worked part-time as graphic designer from home office while managing the complex logistics of childcare and household management that characterized life with young children. Her husband James worked full-time as accountant, was typically absent from the house from 7 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. on weekdays, which meant Sarah was primarily responsible for daytime parenting and for the endless errands and appointments and domestic tasks that maintaining household required. Sarah had brought over a plate of cookies on the Sunday afternoon following Mr. Leonard's Saturday move-in, had knocked on his door intending to offer brief welcome and to establish herself as friendly neighbor who could be approached if Mr. Leonard needed assistance or information about the neighborhood. Mr. Leonard had answered the door, had accepted the cookies with polite gratitude, had introduced himself and Baxter, had engaged in approximately 5 minutes of pleasant but somewhat stilted conversation during which Sarah had offered general information about trash collection schedules and the homeowners association and nearby grocery stores and other practical details that new residents typically needed. The interaction had been fine, not particularly warm or engaging, but appropriate to circumstances of neighbor welcoming new arrival. Sarah had left feeling that Mr. Leonard was polite but reserved, probably not someone who would become close friend but someone who would be perfectly acceptable neighbor who would maintain his property appropriately and wouldn't create any problems. She'd reported the interaction to James that evening in brief summary: the new neighbor seems nice. Quiet older guy, has a friendly dog. Probably keeps to himself mostly. Baxter's impact on Maplewood Lane's social dynamics began not through any deliberate intervention but through the natural behavior of a dog whose breed characteristics included high energy and strong interest in people and tendency to engage with environment actively rather than passively. Dogs are inherently social creatures, lack the human capacity for maintaining polite distance, operate according to simpler principles where interesting things deserve investigation and friendly beings deserve greeting regardless of whether formal introduction has occurred. The first notable incident occurred on the Thursday morning approximately 1 week after Mr. Leonard's arrival, during the morning departure period when Sarah was attempting to load her twins and various necessary supplies into her minivan for trip to preschool drop-off followed by grocery shopping. The logistics of getting 2 4-year-olds and all their required equipment into vehicle were complex under best circumstances, required ensuring both children were dressed appropriately and had eaten breakfast and had used bathroom and had collected their backpacks and any special items needed for preschool activities that day. Then required physically moving both children from house to vehicle while carrying diaper bag and Sarah's own work bag and possibly shopping bags if she was combining the trip with errands. This particular morning, Sarah had managed to get Emma and Sophie strapped into their car seats and had returned to the house to collect the final load of bags and supplies, had set down several bags on the front porch while she locked the door, had picked up what she thought were all the bags and had returned to the minivan only to realize she'd left behind a reusable shopping bag containing the apples and other produce she'd purchased the previous evening and had intended to refrigerate but had forgotten until she was already loading the car this morning. She'd left the minivan running with children secured inside, was only going to be gone for maybe 30 seconds to retrieve the forgotten bag, which seemed like reasonable decision even though parenting guidelines technically recommended never leaving children unattended in vehicles. When she turned back toward the house, she found Baxter standing on her front porch, nosing at the forgotten shopping bag, his tail wagging with evident pleasure at having discovered interesting object. Sarah's first reaction was mild alarm, strange dog on her property, uncertainty about whether the dog was friendly or aggressive, concern about the dog potentially damaging the bag of produce or creating other problems. But Baxter's body language was clearly friendly rather than threatening, the wagging tail, the relaxed posture, the fact that he was investigating the bag with gentle curiosity rather than attacking it, and when Sarah approached cautiously, Baxter looked up at her with expression that seemed almost pleased, as if he was proud of having found the bag she'd apparently lost. "Well, hello there," Sarah said, her alarm diminishing as Baxter's friendliness became apparent. "Did you find my apples?" She knelt down to pet Baxter, who responded with enthusiastic tail wagging and attempt to lick her face, and then picked up the shopping bag while Baxter watched with evident interest. Mr. Leonard emerged from his house at that moment, having noticed Baxter's absence from the yard and having come looking for him. "I'm so sorry," he called across the street, his voice carrying embarrassment and concern. "He must have slipped out when I opened the door to get the newspaper. Baxter, come here." Baxter looked toward Mr. Leonard but didn't immediately obey, seemed more interested in continuing his investigation of Sarah and the interesting bag of produce. Sarah laughed at the dog's evident reluctance to leave this new interaction. "It's fine, really. He found my forgotten groceries, I'd left them on the porch and was about to come back for them. He's actually being helpful." The interaction extended for perhaps 3 or 4 more minutes as Mr. Leonard crossed the street to collect Baxter, as Sarah assured him that no harm had been done and that Baxter was clearly a friendly dog, As the two neighbors engaged in the kind of casual conversation that might have occurred weeks earlier when Sarah had brought cookies, but that actually felt more natural and less forced because it was prompted by Baxter's behavior rather than by deliberate effort to establish neighborly relationship. Sarah mentioned the interaction to her husband James that evening, described it as amusing incident rather than as particularly significant event. But the interaction had created small opening in the pattern of polite distance that characterized Maplewood Lane, had established that Mr. Leonard and his dog were approachable and friendly, had made future interactions feel slightly more natural than they would have felt without this initial positive encounter. Over the following weeks, similar incidents occurred with increasing frequency as Baxter's presence on Maplewood Lane became more established and as his natural sociability created ongoing opportunities for interaction between residents who might otherwise have maintained their established patterns of minimal engagement. The incidents were individually minor, nothing dramatic or particularly memorable in isolation, but accumulated into pattern that was gradually transforming the street's social atmosphere. Mr. Thompson, who lived 3 houses down from Mr. Leonard and who was retired accountant in his late 60s, had routine of walking to end of his driveway each morning to collect his newspaper from the delivery box. The newspaper typically arrived around 6:30 a.m., and Mr. Thompson would retrieve it around 7 a.m. during his morning routine before having breakfast and reading the news. One morning in early October, he opened his front door to find Baxter sitting on his porch with the newspaper in his mouth, having apparently retrieved it from the delivery box and carried it to the door as some kind of helpful gesture. Mr. Thompson's first reaction was confusion. Where had this dog come from? Why was it on his porch? Why was it holding his newspaper? But recognition quickly followed as he remembered the new neighbor's dog that he'd observed being walked around the neighborhood on several occasions. He accepted the newspaper from Baxter with bemused thanks, was rewarded with enthusiastic tail wagging, and then watched as Baxter trotted back across the street toward Mr. Leonard's house. Later that morning, Mr. Thompson crossed the street to mention the incident to Mr. Leonard, intending primarily to ensure that Mr. Leonard was aware his dog was wandering and was retrieving neighbors' newspapers. But the conversation extended beyond just reporting the incident into broader discussion about the neighborhood and about Mr. Leonard's adjustment to living on Maplewood Lane and about Mr. Thompson's own experience as longtime resident. The conversation was pleasant enough that Mr. Thompson mentioned it to his wife Eleanor that evening, describing Mr. Leonard as, "seems like a nice fellow, quiet but friendly enough." Ms. Rivera, who lived next door to Mr. Leonard and who was 78 years old and lived alone after her husband's death 5 years earlier, had routine of doing gentle morning stretches in her backyard, exercises that her physical therapist had recommended for maintaining flexibility and managing her arthritis. The exercises were performed in privacy of her fenced backyard, were part of her morning routine that she'd maintained for several years without any particular awareness that neighbors might be able to observe her. Baxter discovered Ms. Rivera's morning exercise routine perhaps 2 weeks after Mr. Leonard's arrival, having apparently found gap in the fence between properties that allowed him to pass from one yard to the other. Ms. Rivera's first encounter with Baxter during her morning stretches was startling. She'd been in middle of gentle yoga pose when she'd become aware of the dog sitting nearby watching her with evident interest. Her initial alarm had given way to amusement as Baxter had remained seated and calm, had seemed to be observing her exercises with the same focused attention that a student might pay to a teacher's demonstration. The pattern repeated over several mornings. Ms. Rivera would begin her stretches, Baxter would appear through the fence gap, would sit quietly nearby while she completed her routine. Eventually Ms. Rivera mentioned the pattern to Mr. Leonard when she encountered him while both were collecting their mail, had meant to ask him to repair the fence gap to prevent Baxter's visits but had found herself instead expressing that she actually enjoyed the company and didn't mind Baxter's presence as long as Mr. Leonard was comfortable with the dog spending that time unsupervised in her yard. The conversation had led to Mr. Leonard occasionally joining Ms. Rivera during her morning stretches, not performing the exercises himself, but sitting on her patio while Baxter supervised the routine, engaging in the kind of quiet morning conversation that felt natural in that context and that gradually developed into genuine friendship between two elderly neighbors who'd been living adjacent to each other without any meaningful connection until Baxter had created the initial bridge between their properties. Similar patterns emerged across Maplewood Lane. Baxter would appear in various yards, would interact with children playing, would somehow insert himself into situations where his presence created opportunities for neighboring residents to interact. The children in particular loved Baxter, would call to him when they saw him, would ask their parents if they could pet him, would sometimes gather in whatever yard Baxter was visiting to play with him while their parents would gather nearby to supervise, and would end up engaging in conversations that might not have occurred without the shared focus on the dog. By mid-November, approximately 2 months after Mr. Leonard's arrival, Maplewood Lane's social atmosphere had shifted in ways that longtime residents noticed even if they couldn't precisely identify what had changed. People were lingering outside more, were more likely to cross property lines to have conversations, were developing relationships that extended beyond just polite acknowledgement into actual neighborly connection. Sarah had started organizing informal coffee gatherings on Saturday mornings, inviting several nearby neighbors to bring their coffee or tea and gather in her driveway or front yard for 30 to 45 minutes of casual conversation while children played and while Baxter made rounds greeting everyone and receiving attention. The gatherings had started spontaneously. One Saturday morning several neighbors had happened to be outside at the same time and had gathered around Baxter, and Sarah had offered to make coffee, and the gathering had been pleasant enough that someone had suggested making it regular occurrence. The Saturday coffee gatherings had become focal point for neighborhood social life, had created regular opportunity for residents to share information about local issues and upcoming events and personal news that they wanted to communicate to neighbors. The gatherings were casual. People would attend some weeks and skip other weeks depending on schedules and inclination. There was no obligation or expectation of consistent participation, but they were creating a network of relationships that hadn't existed before Mr. Leonard and Baxter's arrival. Mr. Carver, who lived at the far end of Maplewood Lane and who'd been regarded by other residents as reclusive or possibly dealing with mental health issues based on his minimal interaction and his tendency to avoid any social engagement, had been gradually drawn into the expanding social network through Baxter's persistence. Baxter had developed routine of walking the full length of Maplewood Lane during his outings with Mr. Leonard, and during these walks would often stop at Mr. Carver's house and would sit near the front door in what seemed like expectation that Mr. Carver would emerge. Eventually Mr. Carver had emerged, had interacted briefly with Baxter, had engaged in minimal conversation with Mr. Leonard about the dog. The interactions had repeated over several weeks, had gradually extended from just acknowledging the dog to actually talking with Mr. Leonard about various topics, had eventually led to Mr. Carver occasionally joining the Saturday morning coffee gatherings where his presence was welcomed without any particular comment or attention to his previous absence. Mr. Carver's story, which gradually became known to other residents through conversations at the Saturday gatherings, involved his wife's death from cancer 3 years earlier and his subsequent depression and social withdrawal. The depression had been serious enough to require medical intervention, was being managed through medication and therapy, but the social isolation had been reinforcing the depression in ways that treatment was struggling to address. The connections developing on Maplewood Lane weren't solving Mr. Carver's depression, but they were providing social engagement that was helping to counter the isolation, were creating an environment where he felt welcomed rather than judged for his previous withdrawal. The transformation of Maplewood Lane wasn't dramatic or complete. Most residents still maintained busy schedules that limited their time for neighborhood socializing, still spent majority of their time focused on work and family obligations rather than on community engagement. The Saturday morning gatherings typically attracted only 8 to 12 people out of the approximately 60 adults living on the street, and many residents remained relatively disconnected from the emerging social network. But the overall atmosphere had shifted from one of parallel isolation to one of active if modest community, from environment where people maintained polite distance to environment where people genuinely knew each other and engaged in mutual support, from street where neighbors were strangers who shared space to street where neighbors were developing actual relationships that provided both practical assistance and social connection. Mr. Leonard observed these changes with mixture of satisfaction and bemusement. He hadn't moved to Maplewood Lane with any intention of transforming the neighborhood's social dynamics, hadn't been seeking community when he'd purchased the house, had really just been trying to find manageable living situation for himself and Baxter after Margaret's death had made continuing in the previous house feel impossible. But Baxter's natural sociability had created outcomes that Mr. Leonard's deliberate efforts never could have achieved. The dog's tendency to engage with environment and with people, his lack of respect for property boundaries and social conventions about maintaining distance, his simple delight in human interaction and in exploration, these qualities had disrupted the established patterns of polite disconnection that had characterized Maplewood Lane, had created opportunities for connection that residents had apparently been wanting but hadn't known how to initiate on their own. Mr. Leonard himself had benefited from these connections as much as any other resident. The friendships developing with Ms. Rivera and Mr. Thompson and Sarah and other neighbors were providing social support that was helping him navigate the difficult transition of living alone after 40-plus years of marriage, were creating sense of belonging in the new community that was making the relocation feel less like loss and more like opportunity for different kind of life. The relationships weren't replacing what he'd lost when Margaret died. Nothing could do that, and Mr. Leonard wasn't looking for replacement so much as trying to build life that could sustain him through the years he had remaining. But the relationships were making daily life feel less empty, were providing structure and purpose beyond just maintaining his own household, were reminding him that connection and community were still possible even at 73 and even after profound loss. Baxter continued his routines, morning walks with Mr. Leonard, unsupervised explorations when gaps in supervision allowed, interactions with various neighbors and their children and their other pets. The dog had no awareness that his behavior was transforming neighborhood social dynamics, was just being dog following natural inclinations towards social engagement and environmental exploration. But those natural inclinations were continuing to create opportunities for human connection, were maintaining the patterns that had developed over the first 2 months and were allowing those patterns to deepen into genuine relationships rather than just remaining as superficial interactions. 2 years after Mr. Leonard's arrival, Maplewood Lane had become genuinely connected community where residents knew each other well enough to provide mutual support during difficulties and to celebrate together during joys, where the Saturday morning gatherings had evolved into more structured neighborhood association with occasional group activities and shared projects, where newer residents moving onto the street would be actively welcomed and integrated rather than just politely acknowledged. Mr. Leonard was recognized by other residents as having facilitated this transformation even though he consistently attributed it to Baxter rather than to himself. When pressed about his role, he would demur and would note that he'd simply been walking his dog and hadn't been doing anything particularly intentional or strategic, that Baxter's sociability was the real catalyst and that the neighbors themselves were the ones who'd chosen to respond to that catalyst by building actual relationships rather than just maintaining their previous patterns of distance. The modesty was genuine but also obscured Mr. Leonard's actual contribution. Baxter's sociability created opportunities, but Mr. Leonard's willingness to engage in conversations those opportunities generated, his openness to developing friendships despite his natural reserve, his consistent presence and reliability as neighbor, these were necessary complements to Baxter's behavior, were human elements without which the dog's sociability would have just been amusing nuisance rather than catalyst for community transformation. Sometimes connection comes from the most unexpected places. Not from deliberate community-building initiatives or from formal programs designed to foster neighborly relationships, but from simple presences, a friendly dog, a child's question, a shared difficulty, that create natural opportunities for interaction that bypass the social barriers and ingrained habits that keep people isolated even when living in close physical proximity. The lesson isn't specifically about dogs, though dogs' natural sociability does make them particularly effective at creating these kinds of opportunities. The lesson is about paying attention to the opportunities for connection when they arise, about being willing to engage even when engagement requires stepping outside established routines and comfort zones, about recognizing that community is built through accumulated small interactions rather than through dramatic gestures or intensive efforts. Maplewood Lane's transformation didn't require anyone to dramatically change their lifestyle or to commit extensive time to community building. Required only that residents be willing to engage in brief conversations when opportunities arose, to gradually let those conversations develop into actual relationships, to allow the patterns of polite distance to relax enough that genuine connection could form. So pay attention to the opportunities in your own environment, the moments when interaction is possible, the situations where small gesture might create connection, the times when you could choose either to maintain established distance or to reach out in modest ways that might lead somewhere meaningful. The opportunities aren't always obvious, aren't always convenient, don't always come at times when you have energy or inclination to engage. But when opportunities do arise, consider engaging rather than defaulting to maintaining distance. Nurture relationships around you through consistent small gestures, greeting neighbors by name, offering help when you notice need, showing up for community gatherings even when you don't particularly feel social, creating opportunities for others to connect by hosting informal gatherings or by being present in shared spaces. The individual gestures may feel insignificant, may seem like they're not accomplishing anything meaningful. But they accumulate, create patterns, eventually transform environments from isolated to connected. Recognize that your presence and engagement matter even when you're not trying to be particularly impactful, even when you're just being yourself and allowing natural interactions to occur, even when you're not sure whether your small gestures are making any difference. Mr. Leonard wasn't trying to transform Maplewood Lane, was just walking his dog and responding to the interactions that Baxter's sociability created. But those responses accumulated into genuine community transformation that improved life for everyone involved. Pay attention, engage, and nurture relationships around you. Even the smallest gestures matter. Be StoryWise.